Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Shad Marie. Today I'll be doing my April wrap up. So as you can tell, I actually got a haircut recently. So some of my clips that might have gone out already have me with the shorter hair, but this is my first official video, like whole video with my new haircut. But yeah, I don't know, it's like super short compared to before, but my hair feels so much healthier. But anyways, let's just get on with my April wrap up. So as always, starting off with my stats for the month. I don't think I did it last month, but I completely forgot about it until I was like done editing and I was like, something feels missing here, and then it was too late. So anyways, for the month of April, I read a total of 9 books, which isn't amazing, but it's still pretty good, I think. Out of the 9 books that I read, I got 1 2.5 stars, 1 3.5 stars, 5 4-star reads, 1 4.5 stars, and 1 5-star reads. So overall, I actually had a really good month. Majority of them were 4 stars and up, so I'm very pleased about that. So even though the quantity isn't the highest, but I think the quality more than makes up for it. So the first book that I read for the month of April is Hand on the Wall by Maureen Johnson. This one I gave 4 stars. I actually talked about this a lot more in detail in my Goodreads reading vlog for young adult fiction, so I will link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. But this is basically the final book to the Truly Devious series, where Celie finally cracks the case, and it was everything that I imagined. I'm not going to go into details of this book because again, it is the third and final book of an entire trilogy, but essentially this whole trilogy follows a girl called Stevie who goes to this boarding academy called Elohim Academy, and there she tries to solve the mystery that has not been solved since the 1920s or so, and she for some reason decides to make that her big case, and from there she discovers a lot of things about the history, about current events, etc. that's all happening in that boarding school. So there's a lot going on. I really enjoyed it. Highly recommend it if you have not read this already. Then the next book that I read is A Girls Made of Snow and Glass by Melissa Bachador. This one I gave 3.5 stars. So this is essentially a retelling of Snow White, where it follows the true perspective of the evil queen as well as Snow White herself. Mina, who is the stepmother, also the evil queen, found out that her heart was actually made of glass to actually save her life because her real heart was actually rotting away, and it was done so by her magician father. And all she ever wants to do is actually just to learn love, and one day she ends up becoming the stepmother to Lynette. Lynette is obviously Snow White, and she has always adored her stepmother from day one, and each day she grows more and more like her biological mother. She's always curious as to why that is the case, and one day she finds out that she's actually created from snow in her mother's likeness from the same magician, aka Mina's father. But all she ever wants to be is to become fierce and regal like Mina. She actually does not care at all about her biological mother. And then one day Lynette's father comes over and is like, I'm gonna make you queen and give you authority over all the southern kingdoms, which essentially means that Mina's role is now moot. So obviously there's gonna be tension between the two of them. I actually really enjoyed this book. This book had a lot of great feminist messages to it, and I loved how different these characters were portrayed in comparison to the Snow White and the evil queen that we all know. There's also this romance between Lynette and the royal surgeon that I thought was so freaking adorable, and I was always here for it. It actually really brought a nice element to the book overall. My only issue though is actually the pacing of this book. I did find it to be a bit slow and kind of bland at times, and while I enjoyed the ending overall, I didn't think it was anything special or different about it. So basically I thought the book was done really well in terms of the retelling aspect of it, having a more of a feminist twist to it, but overall I was kind of like mainly because of the pacing and the ending. Alright, then this next book that I want to discuss is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. This one I gave 4.5 stars, which probably comes as no surprise to a lot of other people who have really enjoyed this book. This book basically follows a girl called Kaya, who is known as the Marsh Girl. She has lived her entire life just following nature and studying it and understanding it with only 1 day of schooling, and she has essentially lived in isolation her entire life except for the 2 boys that she has grown close to. However, one day she ends up as the main murder suspect when one of them ends up dead with no footprints or evidence left behind. And the reason why she becomes the main murder suspect is because the body was found on the marsh, and she was someone who had a lot of extensive knowledge in terms of how the marsh was, the wildlife, you know, how to get around without anyone suspecting her or detecting her, etc. So that's why she was the main suspect behind everything. This book I thought was actually incredibly well written. I did listen to an audiobook and I thought the narrator did a really good job of bringing all the characters to life. The one issue I had with this book was, again, the pacing. I did find it to be quite slow, especially in the beginning of the book. I felt that the author did a really thorough job in terms of creating the backdrop about Kaya and her family and why she was in isolation for her entire life, essentially. Her absentee father, the family that just abandoned her and her father, and the fact that she was just left all alone on the marsh. So even though I found the pacing to be kind of slow, I can also see why the author did that, because I felt like to really understand the full book, you really understand why she was like that and how she became like that in the beginning. So I understood why the author did that. I just still felt it to be very slow in the beginning, and it took me quite some time to really start to enjoy the book. But the main reason why I was so invested and why I kept reading was actually because of Kaya herself. I was so intrigued as to how she was surviving life on her own ever since she was so young. I mean, her family disappeared on her when she was like 4 or 5 or something like that, and her absentee father was just never there. She had to fend for herself in terms of money, in terms of food. She had to learn to do everything herself. Her father tried at some point, but then was always just like, at the end of the day, always reverted back to his absenteeness ways, and he ended up abandoning her as well. So there were a lot of things that she had to do to survive, and I was so curious about how she was doing so, and she was honestly so incredibly smart. I mean, there was this one scene, which is not a spoiler by the way, where she was just like, you know what, I have to find a way to make some money, and she decides to end up digging for mussels on the marsh and, you know, collecting them and then selling them in town, which I thought was such an ingenious way as to like how this little girl was gonna make some money. And she started doing that on the regular so she could make sure to get enough money for herself, for her food, etc. She learned how to barter and trade with the people in town, and I thought that was just done really well on her end, especially because she was so young. There's also this romance obviously between her and 2 other boys in the book, and even though mistakes were made and time had passed, especially for one of them, I just felt that there were just some things that, you know, were just worth forgiving, and the fact that it's never too late. So I felt like this book had a lot of great messages. I really like the characters. Highly recommend this book. I can see why so many people adored it. I actually lent this book over to my sister when she came over to visit like a few weeks ago, and she ended up reading this book during her stay here, and she loved it. She like came back and she was like, I really like this book, it was so good. Also because like the murder aspect to it, I felt like just brought another element to this book that really elevated it. So yeah, overall highly recommend this if you have not picked this up already. All right, then this next book that I picked up is The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. This one I gave 4 stars. So this is actually the sequel to The Poppy War, and I'm not going to go into too much details about it because again it is the sequel and I don't really want to do any spoilers. But the first book basically follows a girl called Rin who ends up taking this Keiju test, which is this exam that is given to all the young individuals throughout the empire, and if you do well on it, you basically have a good like career set up for you. And she ends up surprising everyone in the entire empire because she not only does well, but she scores first in the entire empire. So that ranking gives her a place in one of the top military academy in Sinigard, and she ends up going there. She discovers that she actually has this inherent magic to her that is very much close with shamanism, which is the lost form of magic that not a lot of people know about. Very little knowledge is there, and most people think it's dead, it's a lost magic, but it's very much not, obviously. And so there's a lot of war in the book, there's a lot of conflict, a lot of political strife going on. It is very, very dense, very intense, a lot of trigger warnings there, but I really enjoyed this book, and this book basically picked up right after the first book. And this was honestly just as satisfying as The Poppy War, just because there's so many actions, so many things going on that I really enjoyed. I did find Ren to be quite reckless in this book, especially just because there were a lot of decisions that she had to make, and in a way I can see where she was coming from because of the circumstances and the choices that were given to her. She didn't have a lot of options, but overall I did find her to be quite reckless in her decision making skills. but again, like I said, I can definitely see where she was coming from. And the ending, guys, was just so freaking intense. I definitely want to find out what's going to happen next, because it is going to be like a wild ride and there's a lot of emotions involved here for sure. So yeah, I can definitely kind of wait to find out what will happen next. Then this next book that I read is You Should See Me in the Crown by Leigh Johnson. This one I gave 4 stars as well. So this book basically follows a girl called Liz, where all she wants to do is actually leave her small town and to go to this prestigious college, and the only way she can do that is to actually have enough money to get there. One day she realizes that there is a scholarship available to whoever is crowned prom king or prom queen, and so because of this she decides to run and take a chance. However, at the same time, the last thing she wants to do is to involve herself in a lot of school drama and events, but she is willing to do a lot of things to get to her college. And throughout this whole thing, there is a romance brewing with a new girl in school. This book was freaking adorable. I really enjoyed the romance, and I really love just reading about Liz learning to accept and embrace herself among her peers. I mean, she always thought that she was too black, too queer, too awkward to really do anything and step out of her comfort zone, but I really enjoy just reading about her journey as she learned to open herself more. End of the day, there's a lot of great messages in this book, such as friendship, love, and just learning to accept who you are. Alright, then this next book that I want to discuss is actually one that I did a dedicated book review on it, which should be up already by this point, so I will link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out, and that is The Four Winds by Chris and Hannah. This book basically follows a girl called Elsa who was shunned by her family, ends up getting pregnant with one of the town's boys as a way to escape her dismal future, and ends up marrying him because of their child. However, his family doesn't really want her just because they had so many plans for him, etc., but obviously they were trying to do the right thing, and so they brought her into their lives. Fast forward 13 years later, she now has a daughter and a son, and she is basically struggling to survive because there is now the great drought, and millions of farms, including the ones that her and her family own, are just suffering and struggling to survive. Her and her children ends up moving to California, especially after her husband just ends up deserting all of them, and after her son faces some health complications because of all the dust. She doesn't realize that the trip west is only the beginning of all the hardships, and that once she gets to California, she's going to face a lot of prejudice, a lot of oppression to her family because of where she comes from. This book was incredibly well written. I really enjoyed reading about Elsa and her life. I just loved her resilience throughout her entire life, just because she was shunned by her family. She, you know, she grew up basically thinking that she had a lot of, she had no self-worth, and despite all of that, she managed to cultivate a life for herself, have a family, have an amazing farm that she really grew to love. And not only that, but of course when she gets to California, just facing all of the oppression and prejudice there, I thought that was really well done on her end. And overall, there were just a lot of great messages about this book, including family, resilience, perseverance, friendship, etc. Like I said already, I did an actual whole review, like an in-depth full review about this book, so I will link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. Then this next book that I picked up is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. This one I gave 4 stars. This book basically follows 2 teenage girls' lives as they clash when they find out their shared father died from a plane crash. And what happens after is that they find out that they are actually half sisters, and that their father has been hiding an entire family in other countries. One of them is in America and the other one is Dominican Republic. And now they're both dealing with this new knowledge and the aftermath. This book, as well as a lot of other books like I mentioned already, is very well written. I love reading about how their lives and their struggles and what they face on the regular were just so different simply because of where they grew up. I mean, one of them is from New York City, and I felt like I related to her very well because I lived there for many years of my life, and so there were a lot of things that she was dealing with that I could relate to because I knew exactly what she was referring to. And the other one was in Dominican Republic, and she faced a lot of very different obstacles that I had faced and the other girl had faced as well. And so it was just really fascinating for me to see her struggles and what she had to deal with on the regular. And I felt like the author Elizabeth did a really good job with connecting with all of the characters and evoking a lot of emotions from them and the reader. aka me. And I did listen to this on audiobook, and I want to say that it was narrated by Elizabeth Acevedo herself, but I'm not 100% sure. But either way though, whoever narrated did a fantastic job, and I highly recommend the audiobook version of this book. I also discussed this book a little bit more in my Goodreads young adult fiction reading vlog, so I'll link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. But then the next book that I want to discuss is Look of the Titanic. This one I gave 4 stars, and this one I discuss a lot more in detail in my May arc reading vlog, so I'll link somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. This book follows a young girl called Laura Luck who decides to board the Titanic in search of her brother to see if they will have a better life in America if they can join as acrobats for one of the famous circus, especially because the owner of the circus is actually on board the Titanic as well. Initially she has some issues boarding the Titanic, but she ends up smuggling and becomes a stowaway on it. And throughout the book she is simply trying to convince her brother to perform an act with her to the owner so he can see how talented they are and see if maybe this will give them a chance to actually join the circus, while also dealing with crew members and trying to make sure they don't find out that she is actually there illegally and not really supposed to be there. The main reason why I was so intrigued in picking up this book is because I realized that this was basically a retelling or like inspired book about the Chinese survivors of the Titanic, and I never knew about them, so I thought it was super fascinating to find out more about them and kind of like see their stories in this book. And it was also just very enlightening to read about her experience as well as the other Chinese passenger experiences during this time period, as they face a lot of discrimination and prejudice from everyone around them. The most surprising element to this book that I thought was really interesting is the fact that the sinking of the Titanic is actually a very small portion of this book. For some reason, because it's so well known, I just assumed there's going to be a larger portion of it, but that's really not the case at all. It's really just like the last 10%, 50%, something like that of the book, where you know the sinking was happening and they were just, you know, dashing around trying to survive, etc. And I was just really surprised by how little that part played in the overall scheme of things. I mean, obviously it was a very important part, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of things that happened in that few moments that I was like, wow, that's very critical, but the meat of the book was definitely in the beginning and the middle. So yeah, I thought that was super fascinating for me, from my perspective, just because I thought it would be the bigger part of the book. But yeah, overall I really enjoyed this book. It started off slow for sure. I definitely struggled with picking it up or just getting into it, but I think it really paid off because I ended up really enjoying it. Alright, then this last book that I read is actually the one that I gave the worst rating my entire month, and that is Sex and Vanity by Kevin Kwan. This one I gave 2.5 stars. This book basically followed a girl called Lucy who is half Chinese and half American, and like a very blue-blooded American, by the way. Her father's side descends from the Mayflower. They are the Churchills from there. So they have a very long lineage. A lot of people are like, oh my god, it's the Churchills. They have a very lengthy genealogy, I suppose, and a lot of, you know, well-known people have come from that family line, and she's one of them. So she faces a lot of pressure from them in that sense to act a certain way, be a certain way, and it's also different from her because she's also half Chinese as well on top of everything. But anyways, point is, she ends up meeting a guy called George at this destination wedding on Capri Island, and right from the start the two of them are essentially at odds with each other, yet they have this undeniable chemistry and attraction towards each other. And during that time period, things escalate and she tries to deny that there's anything going on with him. Many years later, like 5 years later, they end up meeting once again in New York City, and she's actually now engaged and still trying to deny that George is actually still in her heart. The best part about this book, I think, is actually reading about the parts about Lucy struggling with her cultural identity, as well as just fitting in with this very famous Churchill family. And like I said already, there's a lot of expectations, certain expectations that are expected from her, but she's also trying to maintain her Chinese side as well. So I thought that whole discussion was really on point in a way, and I actually really respect that and really enjoyed that element. At the same time though, I found the characters being incredibly childish and so dramatic. I mean, I can see why Kevin Kwan did it like this, because I feel like, you know, he wanted to just make them very dramatic in terms of their wealth, in terms of like how they act, just because, you know, his books Crazy Rich Asians are all about that as well. But I felt like in this book it was just extreme, especially because the characters themselves are also very childish. So the main reason why I think that is the case is actually because in Crazy Rich Asians, the book essentially centers around Rachel, who is your average Asian American, you know, comes up from a mother who was struggling to make ends meet, a single mother. And so from her point of view, she was like very modest. She didn't really have expectations in terms of money and wealth and all that stuff. So I felt like her like center, like the character, she was very like chill, and everyone around her was just like extreme. But in this book, Lucy is also very, very well off, so she was like extreme as well as all the characters around her. So it just made the entire book to be just like childish, dramatic, like extra. So like it just made it even more so than Crazy Rich Asians, where she had like the main character is a little bit more mellow to kind of like calm things down a bit. So I think that's the main reason why this book just seems so much more like intense in that sense, as opposed to Crazy Rich Asians. So yeah, I think that's the main reason why ultimately I was like, damn, these characters are just so childish. So anyways, that's all I have to say for this video. Let me know down below if you have read any of these books before and what did you think about them. How was your reading in April? How did it go? But as always, if you like this video, please do give me a thumbs up. It really does help out my channel. And if you like to see more content of me, please do subscribe and hit the notification bell. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!